look at your screen as a member of the cult-like Zizian's group making her first court appearance today for the killing of a U.S. Border Patrol agent after prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. Teresa Youngblood pleaded not guilty to several charges, including murder. Investigators say the 21-year-old is among a group of radical computer scientists who focused on veganism, gender identity, and artificial intelligence linked to at least 6 killings over 3 states. They're known as the Zizians, and they follow Jack Lasoda, a transgender woman known as Ziz, whose online writing attracted young computer scientists who shared anarchist beliefs. Youngblood is accused of fatally shooting Agent David Malland in Vermont back on January 20th, the day of President Trump's inauguration. A lot to this case, and I do want to bring in Neama Rahmani, the president and co-founder of West Coast Trial Lawyers, also a former federal prosecutor. Neama, obviously a very bizarre case and an investigation that is very active. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Of course, Josh. Thanks for having me. A lot going on in this case.
Yeah, and when you take a look at a case like this and you're talking about not just 6 killings, but those killings also including a Border Patrol agent, law enforcement officer, does that change any of the case itself and how it is prosecuted?
It does, Josh. And obviously, when you're talking about the killing of a federal agent, that is going to be a likely death penalty case, which is what we're seeing here. But I mean, obviously, there's so much more to the story. You have any time you have a cult and cult killings. I mean, it harkens back to the Manson family. And obviously, you have gender identity, transgender issues that tends to get a lot of attention. You have the anarchist component, anti-AI, veganism. There's a lot going on here as far as this young woman's motivation for participating in this murder.
What is kind of the criteria that has to be met for a death penalty case? Because we know that Vermont, where this happened, is not a death penalty state, but this is now a death penalty case. So how does all of that work?
So we have the dual sovereign doctrine, which means that the feds, they can prosecute a case regardless of what the state does. So they can charge over the state. This is what we've seen, for instance, in New York in the Luigi Mangione case. They can charge after the state. We saw that with Derek Chauvin and George Floyd and the McMichaels and Roddy Bryan for Ahmaud Arbery. Or they can charge in lieu of the state, which is really what we're seeing here because it was a federal agent who was killed in this particular case. And really, this is something we're seeing more and more. The Department of Justice is going to step in jurisdictions where there isn't the death penalty. And we're going to see a lot more death penalty cases in federal court, which you typically don't see. Now, you do need some sort of federal jurisdictional hook. In this case, you have obviously a federal officer who was killed, but if you have some sort of interstate component, again, going back to Mangione, crossing state lines, or some sort of terrorism component, in this particular case with Youngblood being involved in a cult and maybe doing this for some sort of political reason, or even if the firearm crossed state lines, that may be just enough to get to some sort of federal basis to charge federal murder. And of course, then the feds can seek the death penalty, even if in a state like Vermont, they haven't had the death penalty since the early 70s.
When you talk about a case like this and you are talking about an alleged cult member, and we talked a little bit about, you know, what this cult does, who they do kind of pray to and who they look at, is there the chance here of a mental component? Is that kind of factored in as you don't know if there is maybe a mental disability or something of that nature?
Absolutely. So when you're talking about the death penalty case, it's not necessarily who done it. You're really weighing the aggravating and mitigating factors. So prosecutors, of course, are going to focus on the fact that this was an assassination of a federal law enforcement officer, really in cold blood and premeditated. And they're going to talk about the history of violence that this cult has been involved with. They attacked parents of someone who was associated with a cult, a landlord who was trying to evict them. So there's really this pattern of violence that does support aggravation and the death penalty. Of course, on the mitigation side, the defense is going to argue this is a young woman. You don't see a whole lot of death penalty cases involving women, much less of this serious nature. She's very young, no criminal history. And they're actually going to use the cult as, and the indoctrination as some sort of diminished capacity or mental illness defense. And, you know, when you are handling death penalty cases as a defense attorney, Josh, your entire job is to keep your client alive. It doesn't matter if you're Brian Koberger in Idaho or you're Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland school shooter in Florida. I expect potentially some sort of plea, or if this case goes to trial, not necessarily defending the case during the guilt phase, but really focusing all their attention to the penalty phase to trying to keep this young woman alive.
Where does the case kind of go from here? Because today was the first court appearance since the prosecutors did announce that they're seeking the death penalty. We know that she entered a not guilty plea to several charges there, including murder. So, what happens next here in this case?
What happens next is the parties prepare their case. Obviously, the prosecution is going to prepare for the case going to trial. You have to, because when it's a death penalty case, there's not really a deal you can offer unless you're thinking, I'm going to offer a life without the possibility of parole deal, which it happens. I mean, Koberger is a perfect example. It was litigated for years. And at the 11th hour, the state of Idaho decided to offer that deal, really to the surprise of everyone. But most death penalty cases go to trial because there's really no deal to be had. So obviously, the government is focusing on this traffic stop that led to the death of this Border Patrol agent. And then, of course, they're going to focus on those aggravating factors for the second part of the case. Now, the defense likely is going to go all in on mitigation. They're going to get any psych records, medical records, whatever they can do to present the mental health to this Vermont jury. Because even though it's a federal case, it's a Vermont jury, and they tend to be very sort of liberal and skew anti-death penalty. So that's going to be probably the most important factor here, Josh, the 12 men and women who are going to decide this woman's fate.
And my last question for you here, and I'm not sure if you can speak to this, but when you are talking about a situation that does involve a cult or an alleged cult-like institution, something of that nature, does the arrest of one cult member likely lead to other cult members being arrested as well? Is there any kind of correlation there?
Of course. So one potential bargaining chip that the defense has is to cooperate against other cult members. And I believe the head of the cult may be at large. There might be some weapons charges we're dealing with. So obviously, as a former federal prosecutor, you're used to prosecuting organized crime. So for instance, I prosecuted a lot of drug cartels, but it can be the mob, it can be street gangs, and it can be cults like this. And if you have someone that has information that leads to the arrest of other people who were involved in crimes of violence, maybe, just maybe, you decide to spare this woman's life, give her a life deal. I'm not saying that's what you're necessarily going to do, but just one of the factors you might consider. If she comes in, she provides information, and you're able to arrest all the other individuals who are involved in this cult, that's something that you might want to consider if you're the U.S. attorney who's handling this case.
All right, Neama Rahmani, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help break down a case like this. Anything you want to add here about any of this before I let you go?
No, I think that's it. We covered everything, but expect to see a lot more of these federal death penalty cases with Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice. So I think really this is just the beginning of many, many more death penalty cases and executions in federal prison and on death row.
All right, Neama, thank you again for taking the time to join us. Have a great weekend.
Of course, Josh, you too. Talk soon.